Deep into the night of March 4th, 1865, a tall, weathered figure hunched over a desk in the White House. The air was thick with the weight of a nation torn asunder by civil war, brothers against brothers, fields soaked in blood, and a union hanging by the frayed threads of resolve. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, penned the words of his second inaugural address, not with the thunder of vengeance or the clamor of triumph, but with a quiet plea for healing. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. Here was a man who held the reins of immense power, yet chose the path of humility, enduring personal anguish and public scorn without lashing out. This is the essence of meekness, not weakness, but a harnessed strength that bends toward mercy and reconciliation. As we reflect on the Beatitude, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," Matthew 5:5, let us draw from Lincoln's life a vivid portrait of this often misunderstood virtue, exploring its depth, its challenges, and its timeless call to us all. Consider the context of Lincoln's era, the mid-19th century America, a cauldron of slavery's moral stain, economic divides, and sectional hatreds that erupted into the deadliest conflict in the nation's history. Born in a log cabin in Kentucky in 1809, Lincoln rose from poverty through self-education and relentless perseverance, yet he never forgot his humble roots. Meekness, in his hands, was not passive resignation, but a deliberate choice amid chaos. Take, for instance, his approach to leadership during the Civil War. Surrounded by a cabinet of rivals, men like William Seward and Salmon Chase, who once dismissed him as an unpolished backwoods lawyer, Lincoln invited them into his inner circle, crediting their ideas and absorbing their criticisms without ego. As historian Doris Kearns Goodwin details in Team of Rivals, he once remarked to a subordinate who complained of a colleague's insults, "If he knew how much I love him, he would not be so angry." This humility fostered unity in a fractured administration, allowing diverse perspectives to forge policies like the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed millions while navigating political minefields. From multiple angles, Lincoln's meekness reveals layers of nuance. Theologically, it echoes the biblical meekness of Moses or Jesus' controlled power submitted to a higher purpose. Lincoln, though not a conventional churchgoer, infused his speeches with scriptural echoes, viewing the war as divine judgment on a nation's sins, including his own side's complicity in slavery. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, he noted in his inaugural, urging empathy over enmity. Psychologically, it demonstrated emotional resilience. Lincoln battled severe depression, which he called the hypo, and buried 2 young sons during his presidency, yet he channeled grief into compassion, often pardoning deserters from the Union Army with notes like, "Let him fight instead of being shot." Sociopolitically, his meekness challenged the era's machismo. Contrast it with Confederate leaders' fiery rhetoric, or even his own earlier, sharper-tongued debates with Stephen Douglas. Yet, this restraint inherited the earth in profound ways. By preserving the Union and abolishing slavery, Lincoln's legacy shaped a more equitable America, influencing global human rights movements from Gandhi's nonviolence to Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights crusade. As we delve deeper into this beatitude today, let Lincoln's narrative inspire us. In a world clamoring for dominance, what if we, like him, chose the quiet strength that binds wounds and builds legacies? Blessed indeed are the meek, for through such grace, they and we might yet inherit a renewed earth. Let us reflect on how this virtue calls us forward.
Matthew 5:5, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meek, Greek, praoi, plural of praus, often misunderstood as weakness, timidity, or passivity. In classical Greek, praus described domesticated animals, example, a tamed horse, power under control. It conveys gentleness, humility, with self-control of your own strength and passions. Horses are wild animals and must have their strength and temperament under control to be of use. What the Greek also alludes to is to have weapons and the ability to use them, but keeping them sheathed. This is what it means to be meek, to keep your temperament and strength under control and to have mastery over your emotions. Within simulation theory, a simulationist would define meekness as the disciplined maintenance of internal code integrity and humble submission to the simulation's foundational rules, without allowing external variables or inputs to override or corrupt one's core processing logic. Internal equations represent an individual's personal code, beliefs, faith alignments, and decision-making algorithms rooted in God's word. Meekness ensures these remain stable, drawing from unchanging divine constants. Changing external values are simulation inputs like trials, societal pressures, or probabilistic events such as illness or accidents. Meekness resists letting them dictate outcomes. instead, processing them through humble obedience to God's foundational law. Within this context, strength is in not allowing external events to determine your responses. It's not passivity, but controlled power and strength under divine constraint, preventing internal system crashes from ego-driven overrides. This definition positions meekness as an optimization strategy by not yielding to external flux. Now the verse Matthew 5:5 has its own origin story, as Jesus learned it from Psalm 37:11, as it is a direct citation. But the humble will inherit the land and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. When we read the verses leading up to Psalms 37:11, we get greater understanding of what blessed are the meek means. Psalm 37:1, 7-10 NASBS. Do not fret because of evildoers. Be not envious toward wrongdoers. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who carries out wicked schemes. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil doing. For evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land. Yet a little while, and the wicked man will be no more, and you will look carefully for his place, and he will. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," this verse is actually restating the premise of Psalms 37, as these passages display an inherent contrast between the godly meek and evil people, stating that the godly should stay meek and not fret or worry about evildoers, as they will not continue to reign. The meek, godly person will eventually rule the land. This is in direct contrast to people who traditionally rule over others. Rulers pronounce their importance and exert themselves above others. Fear, intimidation, displays of power, and self-aggrandizement have been the historical tools of those who exert power over others. In contrast, the meek rule by self-control and submission to God's plan. Jesus, who both embodied this quality in powerful ways, offer us a comparative example that we can examine and learn from. Meekness, as we've explored, isn't about being timid or backing down from challenges. It's a deliberate strength, a blend of humility, patience, and service that aligns with a higher purpose. By looking at the shared characteristics they displayed, we can see how this trait plays out in leadership, relationships, and faith. These aren't just ancient stories. They offer practical wisdom for navigating our own high-pressure world today, where assertiveness often gets mistaken for power. First, consider their shared humility before God and authority, a foundational aspect of meekness that keeps ego in check while remaining in deep trust with God. Moses, described in Numbers 12:3 as the most meek person on earth, consistently acknowledged his own limitations, like when he questioned his calling at the burning bush, saying in Exodus 3:11, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" This wasn't self-doubt for its own sake. It reflected a reliance on divine direction over personal ambition. Jesus echoed this in his life, submitting fully to the Father's plan, even in moments of intense struggle, as in Luke 22:42, where he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." This humility allowed both to lead without the pitfalls of pride, creating space for God's work to shine through. In modern terms, think of it as a CEO who credits their team and mentors rather than hogging the spotlight. It builds lasting influence, but tests come when humility gets tested by success, reminding us that true meekness requires ongoing self-reflection to avoid slipping into arrogance. Another key characteristic they shared is patience amid adversity and criticism, turning potential conflicts into opportunities for God to elevate. Moses endured endless complaints from the Israelites, from their grumbling about manna in Exodus 16 to outright rebellion in Numbers 12. Yet he responded by interceding with God instead of retaliating. This patience stemmed from a long view perspective, trusting that justice would prevail without his immediate intervention. Jesus demonstrated the same restraint, facing mockery from crowds and accusations from leaders, as in Matthew 27:39-44, where he chose silence or forgiveness over defense. His words from the cross in Luke 23:34, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," capture this perfectly. Together, their examples show meekness as emotional intelligence in action, absorbing blows to preserve relationships. Today, this might look like handling online trolls or workplace critics with composure, but highlights that patience is an endless tolerance of abuse. It pairs with wisdom to know when to set boundaries, preventing exploitation.
Then, there's their servant leadership and empathy for the oppressed, a characteristic that flips traditional power dynamics upside down. Moses, once a privileged Egyptian prince, chose to help and support the oppressed Hebrews, advocating for slaves, and later establishing laws in Deuteronomy 24:17-22, to protect widows, orphans, and foreigners. This empathy drove him to serve at great personal cost, reflecting meekness as compassion. Jesus took this further, associating with society's outcasts, like tax collectors in Matthew 9:10-13, and performing acts like washing feet in John 13:17 to model service. He summed it up in Mark 10:45, stating he came not to be served, but to serve. Both prioritized the vulnerable, using their positions to uplift rather than dominate, which in theological terms bridges Old Testament justice with New Testament love. In our context, this inspires community leaders or activists who focus on service without seeking fame. Finally, both exhibited reliance on divine power over personal strength, showcasing meekness as empowered restraint rather than self-sufficiency. Moses learned this through trials, such as moving from impulsive actions like killing the Egyptian in Exodus 2:11-12 to depending on miracles, such as the Red Sea parting in Exodus 14. He attributed successes to God, avoiding the trap of self-glory. Jesus, who could have summoned angels in Matthew 26:53, instead chose vulnerability, healing an enemy's ear during his arrest in Luke 22:50-51. This reliance highlights a core biblical theme, echoed in 2 Corinthians 12:19 NASB's, where God's strength shines in weakness. All this time, you have been thinking that we are defending ourselves to you. Actually, it is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. Their shared approach teaches that meekness amplifies effectiveness by relying on God to achieve success, and not themselves. If you are working to achieve a destiny God has ordained for you, it won't be by your strength alone. You will have to follow Christ's and Moses' example and rely on God for your elevation.
Let's look at the opposite of meekness. Nebuchadnezzar, who was the mighty king of Babylon, stands as a prime example of vanity and personal glorification through his blatant self-boasting and unchecked pride, as shown in Daniel 4:29-33 NASBS. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty?" While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven, saying, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whomever he wishes." Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. We see Nebuchadnezzar walking on the roof of his palace, surveying his empire, and declaring, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" This isn't just casual confidence, it's a deliberate elevation of self, crediting his own strength and ingenuity for achievements that were enabled by divine providence. Meekness, as we've seen in figures like Moses and Jesus, involves humility and recognition of a higher authority. But Nebuchadnezzar flips this, centering everything on his ego, which leads to his dramatic downfall. This self-boasting exemplifies arrogance in action, a mindset that prioritizes personal glory over gratitude or service. Historically, as a conqueror who expanded Babylon into a world power around the 6th century BCE, Nebuchadnezzar had real accomplishments, from grand building projects like the Hanging Gardens to military victories, including the Siege of Jerusalem. Yet, his proclamation ignores the roles of his subjects, advisors, or even the God of Israel, whom he encounters through Daniel's interpretations of dreams. The nuance here is telling. His pride isn't born from nothing, it's amplified by success, a common trap where achievements fuel a sense of invincibility. That's the trap to pride and arrogance. It is blinding. If you have never seen a color before, you can't conceive of the color's existence. Pride and arrogance makes you unable to see your own vulnerability and places you in a dangerous position. Mike Tyson didn't think he could be beaten until he was beaten. Nebuchadnezzar's example profoundly serves as a cautionary tale.
Immediately after his boast, a voice from heaven decrees his humiliation, reducing him to a beast-like state for 7 periods, eating grass, and living outdoors until he acknowledges God's sovereignty. This reversal underscores that self-exaltation invites correction, often through humbling experiences. This story also highlights redemption, as after his ordeal, Nebuchadnezzar praises God in Daniel 4:34-37, showing even the proud can learn meekness through trials. Today, this challenges us to examine our own tendencies toward boasting, whether in career milestones or personal victories, and instead cultivate a posture of humility that invites growth rather than downfall. Reflecting on this, we see how rejecting meekness doesn't just isolate us, it sets the stage for necessary, if painful, realignments toward true strength. Reflecting on these characteristics, we see how Moses and Jesus modeled meekness as a blueprint for inheritance, not just of land or legacy, but of meaningful impact. Their lives challenge us to integrate these traits into our daily life, whether in family dynamics, professional settings, or global perspectives. The implications are transformative. Embracing humility fosters deeper connections with God and others. Patience reduces needless strife, servant empathy builds cohesive communities, and divine reliance unlocks untapped potential. Yet, it's not without challenges. Cultural pressures often reward aggression, so practicing meekness requires intentionality through habits like prayer or journaling. In a world quick to celebrate the loud, these examples remind us that quiet strength endures, reshaping everything from personal growth to societal change. As we ponder this, ask yourself how these characteristics might shift your approach to power and purpose right now. Let's talk about meekness on a much larger scale, right in the middle of our chaotic world. Imagine meekness as a mindset, not just for individuals, but for entire nations or groups of navigating powers. In our global landscape, we see this playing out in real time. The West, comprised of the United States and Europe, have historically approached the world like a high-stakes video game, like Command and Conquer, focused on conquest, full of boasts, threats, and intimidation tactics. They're always shouting from the rooftops, flexing military might or economic sanctions to dominate surrounding nations. It's aggressive, it's loud, and it often grabs headlines. But does it lead to long-term inheritance of influence? The paradigm has shifted. Building is now conquering destruction. The different strategy, BRICS, Brazil, India, Russia, China, South Africa, is one that embodies true meekness, staying quiet, focusing on building, and letting actions speak louder than words. These nations invest in infrastructure, alliances, and economic foundations without the fanfare. They're like city planners in a SimCity simulation game, zoning for growth, balancing resources, and creating sustainable systems that endure. Over time, this approach accumulates real power, not through destruction, but through creation. We've seen this in recent geopolitical shifts, where BRICS prioritizes development banks, trade networks, and tech advancements over saber rattling. By 2026, these builders control a massive share of global resources and GDP, quietly reshaping the world map while NATO countries exhaust themselves in color revolutions, regime change operations, and proxy war confrontations. This isn't just abstract theory. It's rooted in biblical wisdom that echoes through philosophy and history. In the Psalms, like Psalm 37:11, we get the same promise. The meek inherit the land because they trust in a bigger plan, refusing to get baited into reactive fights. Lao Tzu put it another way in ancient wisdom, saying, "The soft and flexible overcome the hard and rigid." Meekness here means harnessing power with humility, choosing long-game strategies over short-term wins. Consider ancient examples, such as the Persian Empire under Cyrus, which expanded through smart integration and roads that connected people, outlasting more brutal conquerors. Or post-World War II, rebuilding efforts that turned ruins into economic powerhouses through aid and planning, not vengeance. But let's bring it closer to everyday life. On a personal level, meekness might look like handling a heated argument at work by listening first, building understanding instead of firing back. It could mean investing in your community's future through quiet acts of service, like mentoring or volunteering, rather than seeking spotlight recognition. Nations mirror this too, when leaders opt for diplomatic bridges over walls or economic partnerships over isolation. They're practicing meekness that leads to inheritance. The nuance is key. Meekness isn't naivety. It requires wisdom to know when to act, discernment to avoid confrontation, and resilience to weather storms. The implications are huge for us today. In a world of escalating tensions, from trade wars to territorial disputes, embracing meekness could shift outcomes toward cooperation and shared prosperity. It challenges us to ask, are we building legacies that last or chasing fleeting victories? If meekness inherits the earth, it's because it aligns with enduring truths, creating spaces where everyone thrives. So, as we reflect on this, consider how meekness fits into your own story. It's not about being small, it's about playing the long game with grace and watching that quiet strength reshape everything around you.